Let's do a quick history lesson because too many voters are being driven by just stereotypes and falsehoods. Number one, let's talk about immigration, which has been driving a lot of the elections in the West. Number one, remember that a lot of immigrants are in the West because they betrayed their own people in the East. So let's take Taiwan or Chinese Taipei. What is that? What is the country? Who is there? The Taiwanese are, in a nutshell, people who fled the Chinese Revolution. And they fled because they were essentially siding with the West. And that's why Eisenhower protected them when they fled mainland China into a small island off the coast of China. And so, number one, now what are the consequences of that? Well, one of the consequences is that, you do, of course, want to support the people who are giving you information. We don't want to call all of them spies, right? But we want to support the people who are giving you information overseas. All right? They're probably far more valuable than anything the CIA could ever come up with. And in fact, probably would render the CIA useless without their help about, people on the ground, what products they're using, what they're doing, the kind of language, the kind of dialects. These are not things that you can gather on your own. And what are the consequences of all of this? Well, number one, if you go to Cupertino, where Apple Computers is, if the relationship works out favorably, for the West, you end up having a place like Cupertino where you have a lot of people there who are from Taiwan. They go over, you go down in Cupertino, you don't have only Apple Computers, which of course is dependent on semiconductor research. You also have bubble tea, you have a lot of other items that you don't necessarily find anywhere else in the United States, at least not commonly. So you see right away, look at Vietnam, so San Jose, which is nearby Cupertino. You go to San Jose on the east side, you have a lot of Vietnamese restaurants. I used to eat there every weekend because the food was just so good. And again, why are the Vietnamese immigrants there? Again, Vietnam War. The United States brought those people back after they lost the war in Vietnam. Now, you think about all these things and you start to realize, number one, you start to realize that obviously the problem is not with the parents, right? No one's got an issue with a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old Vietnamese immigrant or Taiwanese immigrant. And indeed, there really wouldn't be a basis for doing so. And by the way, you also see very quickly why revolutions overseas have such murderous consequences, because oftentimes, people discover infiltrators among them, or spies among them, people who are allegedly spies, and that's when you start killing everybody in sight in order to cleanse yourselves of, potential threats. And that's, of course, also when all the airlifts happen, and so on and so forth, when things get out of control. But back to, say, the Vietnamese example and the older people example, a lot of the problems we see are with the first generation, not necessarily, the immigrants themselves, but the assumption that the people who look different are immigrants. It's quite likely that you're dealing with the children of immigrants who have not been, quote unquote, assimilated into society. Now, whose fault is that? Because remember this, if it's just, ethnicity or culture, well, the parents would be, problematic as well. And yet we really don't see that, right? The study after study shows that, the older immigrants are perfectly fine, more law-abiding than native-born citizens in the U.S. So you really want to figure out who do you really want to blame to the extent that there are, higher crime rates among certain groups. And, where do you put the blame on that? And very few people are putting the blame on the schooling system, on education, even though, say, in California, the teachers' unions control a pension fund that's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. People don't believe me when I say that, but you can just Google CalSTRS, CalSTRS, and just go down and look at the pension fund or look at investments. And you'll see essentially that every sort of group in the United States that is native born, for the most part, is dependent on subsidies or financial support somehow from either Wall Street or DC. This is true also in Iowa. The whole state essentially runs on corn, and you have to have a whole different ball game on that issue as well. So number one, you really want, if you're a history teacher, you you really want to blame yourself if there's a problem in the United States when these voters who are teenagers grow up and just haven't had the opportunity to learn history properly and start to point fingers at each other. Because if there's one thing that history ought to teach you is, number one, and most of what happens is somewhat logical and somewhat, causal. And, we just talked about that. But here's the number two problem in America. Remember, you have a country that was founded as a republic. That's where the word Republican comes from, as a republic, in order to prevent Catholic Church corruption. So you have a wave of immigrants coming in. You've got, the Catholic Church becoming the Anglican Church as a type of reform against the Catholic Church. You have the French Revolution, which was, again, against the Catholic Church. You go back and forth. And you start out as a country that is designed, that in fact banned the Catholic Church in different places, including in New York City, to a country that, is so unconcerned about religious corruption of the type that caused the immigrants to come to the United States from Europe, so unconcerned about that it now has a Catholic president, a former Speaker of the House that is Catholic, a Supreme Court that is majority Catholic, that actually states, believe it or not, in originalism, that actually promotes, on the conservative side, a lot of whom are Catholics, they actually promote originalism, which makes no sense, because the original founders would have never wanted a Catholic Church. You go look at the Declaration of Independence, go look at the Constitution. Of those documents, all the signees, only one is Catholic. Everyone else is a kind of a Protestant. What does the word Protestant mean? Protestant. What are they protesting against? Think about that. So in order to go from, in order to create that 180-degree change, you have to change history. And, that's difficult because a lot of times you're covering things up, you're hiding information. And this isn't just back then. You got McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was Catholic. The Catholic Church supported the Vietnam War, by the way. They wanted to split it up, the country, into a northern Buddhist and southern Catholic. If you don't believe me, go ahead and look at who they installed. Just Google Archbishop, Vietnam War. Let's see, what was his name? I don't remember off the top of my head. But again, literally the brother of the person who was installed was an archbishop. Or just read Warren Hinkle, who was based in San Francisco, and so on and so forth. So in order to have that sort of progression or change, you have to basically rewrite history. Because, of course, now that you're in power, you don't want the same thing to happen. You don't want what happened in Mexico, where the government seized the property of the Catholic Church to happen again. A military general gave it back eventually. You don't want all these things to happen. But in fact, it looks like institutional culture is not easy to change. And so now you're looking at, a lot of people pointing fingers. And in fact, if you want a better version of history, or you probably have to go to the BBC, you probably have to go to England if you speak English, because they were able to reform the Catholic Church by creating the Anglican Church. And so if you're looking for history, it's unlikely that you're going to find a better history in any modern American textbook. You probably have to go to the UK, the British Library, the London Library, the BBC, and so on and so forth. And that should tell you all you need to know about the state of affairs in the United States, that in fact you have to go to a foreign country to get an accurate version of your own history, because in fact a lot of the content that's been published for the last 30 years is either inferior or incomplete, which again ought to tell you that perhaps the teachers might be more at fault than anyone else in that country, to the extent that social cohesion is fracturing.